New Hampshire, New England. Late autumn of 1985. If you try to imagine this region in November, a classic landscape of the American Northeast appears before your eyes. Endless dense forests colored in crimson and gold, gradually fading under the onslaught of approaching winter. Cool mist rising from the lakes in the mornings, and the sleepy tranquility of small, secluded towns. The town of Allenstown was exactly such a place, where life moved slowly, and the biggest event of the week could be a school fair or the opening of the hunting season. The vast Brook State Park, stretching for thousands of acres around the town, was considered the pride of local residents. Families came here for picnics, wildlife lovers sought solitude here, and hunters charted their routes through it. It was a world frozen in its quiet provincial serenity, where people were used to trusting one another and not locking their doors at night. But on November 10, 1985, this illusory peace shattered when an accidental hunter stepped off the beaten path deep into the woodlands, not far from an abandoned store and an old trailer park. Among the thick thickets of trees, hidden from the eyes of casual passers-by, stood an old, rust-covered 55-gallon metal drum. Chemicals were usually transported or fuel and lubricants stored in such industrial containers, and at first glance, it seemed like ordinary trash that someone was too lazy to take to the town dump. But the barrel was tipped on its side, and a heavy, distinctive smell, unlike anything else, emanated from its slightly open, deformed lid, causing the hunter's dog to freeze dead in its tracks. The man approached, overcoming the nausea rising in his throat, and looked inside. What lay hidden in the darkness of the rusty metal, wrapped in pieces of old plastic, made him rush back to his car in terror. When the first patrol cars and state police detectives arrived at the scene, they realized they were facing something transcendently cruel. Inside the barrel were the remains of two people. They were a woman and a young girl. The autopsy established that they had been killed several months, or perhaps even years, before they were found, and all this time their bodies had been decomposing in a cramped iron crypt in the middle of a popular natural park. Forensic examiners determined that the woman was between 23 and 33 years old, and the girl was between 9 and 11. The cause of death for both was severe blunt force trauma to the head. They were unclothed, and no documents, personal belongings, or jewelry were found with them. The killer had done everything to erase their identities, turning them into silent ghosts of the deep woods. The Allenstown police and New Hampshire detectives launched a massive search. They checked hundreds of missing persons reports across the country, sent fingerprints and dental records to all major police departments in the United States and Canada. But the answer was only a hollow, ominous silence. No one was looking for this woman. No one had reported the disappearance of a little girl with blonde hair. It was as if they had materialized from nowhere and vanished into the darkness of the rusty barrel. Shaken by this tragedy, local residents took the fate of the forest discoveries to heart. Since the victims had no names, the town organized the funeral at its own expense. They were buried in the local cemetery under modest headstones that bore only their approximate age and the date of the horrific discovery. For years, strangers came to these graves, bringing flowers and stuffed animals, trying to atone for the absolute cruelty and indifference with which these souls had been discarded from life. Years passed. The Brook case files gathered dust in the archives. The detectives who began the investigation retired, and the story gradually turned into a grim urban legend used to scare disobedient children. The town of Allenstown sank back into its sleepy tranquility, confident that the worst was already behind them, and the forest wilderness no longer held any secrets. But time has an amazing ability to repay debts, especially when the living try to forget about the dead. On November 9, 2000, almost to the day 15 years after the first discovery, the nightmare returned to Brook. A forest ranger patrolling remote areas of the park noticed another identical rusty metal container in the thick brush, just 100 meters from where the first barrel had stood. It was half buried under fallen leaves and soil, as if nature were trying to swallow the evidence of human sin. When investigators arrived at the scene and opened the second barrel, cries of horror echoed through the forest thicket, shocking even seasoned operatives. Inside were the remains of two more young girls. One appeared to be between 2 and 3 years old, the other between 3 and 4. They were hidden in exactly the same way, wrapped in the same plastic, and killed in a similar manner, by blunt force trauma to the head. The discovery of the second container completely overturned the investigation's understanding of the scale of the tragic event. It became clear that 15 years ago, the police had stopped their search too early. And all this time, while the town's residents prayed at the cemetery for the souls of the first 2 victims, the bodies of 2 more children lay right nearby, beneath a layer of autumn leaves, deprived of the right to a name and a proper burial. From that moment on, the investigation into the Brook case reached a completely different level, as it was already the 21st century and forensic scientists had technologies at their disposal that detectives in 1985 could only dream of. First, scientists conducted DNA analysis on all 4 victims, hoping to find answers to key questions. And the results of this analysis sent shivers down the spine of the entire investigative team. It turned out that the adult woman from the first barrel was the biological mother of the older girl from the same barrel and the youngest girl from the second container. They were one family, a mother and her 2 daughters. But the biggest and most frightening mystery lay hidden in the profile of the third girl, the one who was about 3 to 4 years old. DNA analysis showed that she had no relation to the woman. She was not her daughter, and they shared no maternal genes. But when scientists conducted an advanced study of nuclear DNA, they discovered something astonishing. This small, lonely girl from the second barrel was the biological daughter of the killer. The person who committed this monstrous atrocity had cold-bloodedly taken the life of his own flesh and blood, packed her body into an industrial container, and thrown it into the woods along with an unrelated woman and her children. This discovery completely altered the psychological profile of the perpetrator. Detectives realized they were looking not just for a random robber or a mad hitchhiker, but for a calculating, ruthless manipulator, a family annihilator who traveled the country, entered into relationships with women, bent them to his will, and then completely destroyed them, erasing any traces of their existence. Yet, the investigation still did not have a single clue that could name this monster. The killer's DNA profile was uploaded to the National CODIS database, but the system returned 0 results. The criminal had never been convicted of a crime requiring the collection of biological material. His name was not in any police registry. He remained an invisible ghost, skillfully sliding between states, changing guises and passports. To understand how the cunning killer managed to fool the entire American law enforcement system for so long, we need to travel thousands of kilometers away from chilly New Hampshire to the sunny coast of California. There, in the early 1980s, surrounded by palm trees and ocean breezes, lived a man known to locals by the name of Robert Evans. He worked as a handyman and carpenter, frequently changed his residence, and gave the impression of a reserved but completely harmless man. In 1985, the very year the first barrel was found in Brook Park, this man appeared in Contra Costa County alongside a charming little girl named Lisa. He claimed to be her single father, alleging that her mother had abandoned them and left for an unknown destination. Those around him believed his story and pitied the single father, but a few years later, Evans unexpectedly abandoned Lisa to the care of strangers in a trailer park and vanished without a trace. Social services and the police took an interest in the abandoned child. A criminal case was opened for child endangerment, and the fugitive father was put on the wanted list. He was caught only in 1989 under the name of Curtis Kimball. The police took his fingerprints, and it turned out that this man had been detained previously under other names for car theft and petty larceny. He was convicted, but due to the imperfections of the system and bureaucracy, he served a short sentence and was released on parole, dissolving once again into the vast country. In the early 2000s, this same man, but now under the name of Larry Vanner, appeared in San Francisco. He became involved with a young woman named Un-Soon Jun, a chemist by education who was looking for simple human happiness. Their relationship developed rapidly, but in 2002, Un-Soon suddenly stopped contacting her relatives. Her loved one sounded the alarm, and police searched Larry Vanner's house, discovering the dismembered remains of the unfortunate woman buried in cat litter in the basement. It was a brutal, cold-blooded murder, and this time, the criminal failed to escape. He was arrested, fingerprinted, and his DNA was analyzed. Scientists decided to check whether he was truly the biological father of that same girl, Lisa, whom he had abandoned in the 80s. The DNA analysis showed that he had no relation to her whatsoever. Lisa was someone else's child, whose mother this man had apparently also killed many years ago. The perpetrator was sentenced to a lengthy prison term for the murder of Un-Soon Jun. While behind bars, he refused to provide his real name, would not answer questions about his past, and behaved like a man who knew that if he opened his mouth, such abysses of nightmare would come pouring out that any punishment would pale in comparison. In December 2010, this mysterious prisoner died in a California prison of natural causes. He went to his grave under an assumed name, taking all his secrets with him, confident that no one would ever link an obscure California inmate to the rust-covered barrels in the distant forests of New Hampshire. But the killer underestimated the power of evolving science and the stubbornness of people who were unwilling to accept the anonymity of the Brook victims. In the mid-2010s, specialists in a new, revolutionary discipline, forensic genetic genealogy, took over the investigation. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick and independent enthusiast researchers came to the detective's aid, among whom a woman named Rebecca Heath occupied a special place. She was not a professional investigator. She worked as a librarian, but she possessed an incredible analytical mind and a heightened sense of justice. Rebecca spent hours, night after night, sitting on specialized genealogical forums, studying DNA databases where ordinary people uploaded their profiles to find distant relatives and build family trees. The researchers took a DNA sample from that same little girl in the second barrel, the one who was the killer's daughter, and uploaded it to the commercial database GED-Match. The system produced several matches with people who were the girl's third and fourth cousins. A titanic, painstaking effort began to reconstruct the branches of a massive family tree. The genealogists moved backward into the past to common ancestors from the early 20th century, and then traced forward into modernity, checking every male born into that family who could have been in New Hampshire in the 70s and 80s. And then, in 2016, the search threads converged on a single name: Terry Peter Rasmussen. This was his real, authentic name given to him at birth. He was born in 1943 in Colorado, served in the Navy, was married, and had children, but at some point, his personality underwent a terrifying transformation. He abandoned his official family, severed all ties with relatives, and embarked on a free, bloody voyage across America. When detectives compared Terry Rasmussen's DNA profile with the DNA of that same prisoner, Larry Vanner, who had died in a California prison in 2010, the computer returned a 100% match. The Brook monster had finally found his real name. The press immediately dubbed Rasmussen the chameleon killer for his incredible ability to completely change identities, names, documents, and backstories. He slithered across the country like a snake shedding its skin after every new crime. He was in New Hampshire in the late 70s under the name of Bob Evans, working at a local sawmill and having access to those very industrial barrels that later became crypts for his victims. Unraveling the killer's identity was a monumental success, but for the detectives and Rebecca Heath, it was not enough. The killer was dead and could not be punished, but a woman and 3 children who had no names still lay in the forest soil of Allenstown. Justice remained half done as long as these souls remained unidentified. Rebecca Heath focused all her efforts on finding the mother and the 2 children. She understood that Rasmussen met women through newspaper advertisements, at bus stations, or in small cafes. He looked for lonely, vulnerable mothers who lacked support from loved ones, women who wanted to start life with a clean slate and were ready to trust a tall, confident carpenter. Rebecca began combing through old ad archives and genealogical forums, searching for stories about women with 2 young daughters who had suddenly stopped contacting their relatives in the late 1970s. And in 2017, her attention was caught by a thread on a website where a California resident was looking for her sister named Marlise. The post stated that Marlise had left home on Thanksgiving Eve in 1978, along with her 2 young daughters, Marie and Sarah, after a major family argument. She had left with a man named Bob Evans. The relatives thought Marlise was simply offended by them, had severed all ties, and started a new, happy life somewhere on the other side of the country. They did not report it to the police because in those years, an adult had every right to leave and choose not to communicate with family. They expected that one day she would cool down, call, or send a Christmas card, but the phone remained silent for 40 long years. Rebecca Heath contacted the Honeychurch family. When the relatives provided their DNA samples for analysis, scientists in the laboratory compared them with the DNA of the remains from the Brook barrels. The results of this study silenced all of America. In June 2019, the New Hampshire State Police officially announced that 3 of the victims from the barrels had finally regained their real names. The adult woman turned out to be 24-year-old Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch. The older girl from the first barrel was her daughter, 6-year-old Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, and the tiniest baby from the second container was her youngest daughter, 11-month-old Sarah Lynn McWaters. They were not nameless drifters. They were beloved daughters, granddaughters, and sisters, whose photographs in old family albums preserved the memory of happy, bright days when they still smiled at the world. Their lives were brutally, cold-bloodedly cut short by Terry Rasmussen, just a few months after they trusted him and left with him for New Hampshire. Marlise's relatives, who arrived in Allenstown, could not hold back their tears at the very graves they had walked past for so many years, never suspecting who lay beneath them. In that same year of 2019, the old, nameless headstones in the Allenstown Cemetery were permanently removed. In their place, beautiful granite slabs were installed, funded by the community and the family, with their real human names engraved in golden letters: Marlise, Marie, and Sarah. After 34 years of darkness and oblivion, thanks to a single drop of DNA preserved by scientists of the past and the stubbornness of people of the present, they returned home. Their souls finally found peace, and their names were forever inscribed in history as a symbol that love and memory are stronger than any human cruelty, no matter how sophisticated. But in this story, which resembles an epic detective novel, one unhealed, bleeding wound still remains. That same third girl, who was about 3 to 4 years old, whose remains lay in the second barrel and who was the biological daughter of Terry Rasmussen himself, remains nameless to this day. Her DNA profile is known, and scientists know that her mother was a woman from Texas or Virginia, but no one in those states has yet reported a little girl missing in the late 70s. Her mother, most likely, also fell victim to the chameleon killer, and her body rests somewhere in an unmarked grave or at the bottom of an abandoned well that has yet to be found. This little girl still lies in the cemetery under an inscription that reads, "Unknown Child," serving as a silent reproach to our entire society, a reminder that the investigators' work is not yet finished. The investigation into the Bear Brook case continues, as detectives and genealogists check new branches of family trees daily, hoping that sooner or later, the last headstone in this cemetery will also speak, and the child will receive her rightful name. This story leaves behind a deep, complex aftertaste. It shows us how vulnerable a human being can be in the face of calculating, systemic evil, and how easily the law enforcement system can fall victim to its own patterns and missed time. If investigators in 1985 or 2000 had shown just a bit more meticulousness, if they had checked old databases of illegal trailer parks, perhaps Terry Rasmussen would have been caught much earlier, and the lives of Unsoon June and many other women would have been saved. But at the same time, this story is the greatest hymn to human mercy and the triumph of science. It proves that for justice, there is no such concept as too late. After decades of hollow silence, when all tracks were erased, witnesses died, and the metal of the barrels decayed, the truth still broke through, restoring human dignity to those from whom it was stolen. Take care of those who are dear to you. Do not remain indifferent to others' misfortune. And remember that every person on this earth must have a name, because as long as we remember their names, they continue to live in our hearts, and this light over their graves will never go out. On this note, the story of Bear Brook finds its temporary pause, and we will see you in the next case.